120Hz gaming is coming to consoles. It's not going to be enabled in all titles, far from it, but the processing power is there for developers to take advantage of higher refresh rate gaming, and the possibilities are intriguing. The biggest statement of all comes from Microsoft with the announcement that Halo Infinite, a key launch title for Xbox Series X, will support 120 frames per second in its multiplayer component. This is a monumental leap for the franchise, a real statement of intent, and there are others too. Gears 5 is going to get 120Hz support for multiplayer, as is Ori and the Will of the Wisps, both set to double the 60 frames per second possible on their current gen counterparts. The selection of supported games is short right now, but we should expect more announcements as we edge closer to the arrival of next-gen hardware. So how does 120 frames per second make a difference over 60? What games are confirmed so far? And finally, what kind of 4K TV or monitor do you need to enjoy it? But to begin with, why are developers pushing for 120 frames per second in some titles? As we've mentioned in our high refresh rate PC coverage across the months, the answers are twofold really. Faster response from the controller and also smoother motion. Put it this way, the more frames you see, the quicker the turnaround is from the controller input to the results manifesting on screen. And this happens for two reasons. First of all, game code is executing at twice the speed, reducing internal latency. And secondly, the screen itself is updating twice as quickly. New frames are delivered at 8.3 millisecond intervals as opposed to 16.7 on a 60Hz display. Put simply, new visual information gets to you more quickly. On top of this, games also benefit from more fluid motion, especially for anything with lots of lateral motion. We call this temporal resolution. It's not simply adding extra detail within the frame, but instead it's doubling the rate at which you receive new visual information from the display. So, for shooters and 2D side-scrolling platformers, this could be a genuine game changer. But of course, for now at least, high refresh rate gaming has been the preserve of the PC platform, and 120Hz displays are nothing new. They've been available for almost a decade now, and in actual fact, Asus has a new screen coming that hits an astonishing 360Hz refresh. Aside from the custom display used in PlayStation VR, we've yet to see consoles utilize high refresh rate technology. Despite some early signs of potential, Xbox One S and the X have support for 120Hz output in the operating system, alongside variable refresh rate support. And yet no games at the moment support 120 frames per second. Essentially what we're seeing here is Microsoft laying the foundations for next generation support, and by introducing the features on today's Xbox One S and the X, display manufacturers have existing mainstream consumer level hardware to hone their support for. But why no 120Hz games in the here and now? Well, a big hurdle is in the rendering demands put on the CPUs and the GPUs of these machines to achieve that colossal throughput. To output a 120Hz signal from the console is one thing, it's all down to the display controller. But actually delivering 120 frames per second software is something else entirely. Understandably, 30 and 60 frames per second have been the targets of this generation, but there is scope for improvement in select titles. So, what games are confirmed for next-gen 120Hz support so far? We have a flagship heavyweight in the form of Halo Infinite, as confirmed by Microsoft after its games showcase for Series X. As a first-person shooter, it'll produce a huge improvement to input responsiveness and also the raw motion of play. As a cross-gen title, it may well give Series X owners a tangible advantage in online play over last-gen versions, perhaps more so than any conceivable resolution boost. Likewise, we should expect to see Gears 5 benefit immeasurably too. We can already see the difference in motion with this side-by-side comparison of the PC version. Between 60 and 120 frames per second, we've slowed this down in speed to show the extra animation detail you get. And because of the nature of LCD screens, the fact that we're refreshing the panel twice as quickly means that we should see a considerable reduction in ghosting as well, something that should apply to all 120Hz supported titles. At the Xbox Games Showcase, Microsoft revealed that Ori and the Will of the Wisps supports 4K at 120 frames per second. The game looks beautiful and doesn't appear to compromise its visuals to achieve it. Due to the fixed side-on perspective of the camera and the nature of the visuals themselves, having a high resolution and a high refresh rate should produce some incredible results. Ori also breaks with the trend of shooters being the showcase for 120Hz gaming, and instead makes a great case for platformers using the technology to improve temporal resolution in lateral motion. Smoother scrolling, essentially. We're using the PC version here to showcase the effect, but it's clear that animation is a huge focus for the game, and it should be great to see it come alive at 120 frames per second at 4K resolution on a living room panel. Codemasters Dirt 5 is also confirmed to have 120 frames per second support on Xbox Series X and also PlayStation 5 too. While Microsoft has talked a fair bit about gaming at 120 frames per second, hasn't really been a focus for Sony, but it has confirmed the HDMI 2.1 display controller that opens up 120Hz as an option to developers, an option that clearly Codemasters is exercising. For driving games, it's clearly a benefit, delivering more frames to assess the breaking point of a corner, to thread the needle of a chicane at high speeds, all good stuff. It takes Codemasters' usual 60 frames per second target for the series and doubles it, something we would hope to see in its other driving titles. So yes, Dirt 5 is the first 120 frames per second title confirmed for PlayStation 5, and the list from here on out shows Microsoft's machine with the remaining majority of confirmed titles. We saw the first-person shooting of Exomecha with some gorgeous post effects alongside the dinosaur-themed Second Extinction and the rhythm-based gunplay of Metal Hellsinger. Finally, we have confirmation that the Echo the Dolphin-inspired scroller Orphan of the Machine does have 120 frames per second support as well. Clearly, these are all welcome announcements. But these are the games that we know about, the tip of the iceberg. In theory though, which titles would potentially be a good fit for 120Hz technology? And more to the point, where would it be feasible? In the main, major studios will still likely prioritize 30 or 60 frames per second as their targets of choice for cutting-edge visuals. After all, support for 120Hz is going to be restricted by the overall user base. In a market dominated by 60Hz LCD, most of which won't have HDMI 2.1 support, it makes sense to focus still on 30 and 60 FPS. Now, we can hope to see support for it in less demanding 2D titles like Orphan of the Machine, and also as an optional mode in select games, potentially with a trade-off there in resolution. Titles vying for top-end visual features, higher resolutions or ray tracing effects may still want to target 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second in the meantime. But there is huge potential for 120 frames per second ports of older games. For example, depending on how their original engines are architected, PS4 and Xbox One games running at 60 frames per second could potentially run at 120 via next-gen updates. We're already seeing it with the likes of Gears 5, in its multiplayer at least, and Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Makes sense to see older software served at higher refreshes, double the frame rate if you like, where visuals are otherwise left largely as is. Consider the current generation as a comparison point in this sense. PlayStation 3 games like The Last of Us ran with a 30 frames per second target originally, but got a 60 FPS boost on PS4. The Naughty Dog game landed with the same core assets and geometry, though shadows were improved. All of this made it easier for the machine to render the same game at a higher resolution and with double the frame rate. But the real question is the extent to which the appetite for this support will be there, bearing in mind that we should expect to see 4K 60Hz screens prevalent for some years to come. And in terms of bang for the buck, it would make far more sense for Sony to mine its PS4 back catalogue for some of its amazing 30 frames per second games, bumping them up to full 4K 60. I mean, check out what the increase to temporal resolution here does to Uncharted 4. It's transformative. If you're wondering how we managed to get this phenomenal looking footage, we used the game's slow motion mode and then ran the captures at high speed. It's a fascinating preview of what could be. With all of the potential of 120 frames per second laid out then, what hardware do you need to enjoy it? What TVs and monitors have the right setup for future-proofing? Okay, so look, if you've recently bought a 4K screen with the existing HDMI 2.0 standard, you may need an upgrade, but it's actually worth checking the specs of your screen. HDMI 2.1 delivers the required bandwidth to offer up 4K resolution at 120 Hz. However, many existing screens support 120 Hz at 1080p or 1440p resolutions, and that may well be enough for many high refresh rate games of the next generation era, which we would expect to run at lower resolutions in many cases anyway. Even in the here and now, the current Xbox One dashboard supports 120 Hz output for both the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X. And I'd expect to see that broader support for capable displays to transition to Series X. How PlayStation 5 will handle it though? Well, we just don't know. But if you're looking to support native 4K at 120 Hz, HDMI 2.1 support and a 120 Hz panel are the requirement. In terms of 4K TVs, Digital Foundry highly recommends LG's OLED range to tick both boxes. Whether it's the 2019 B9 and C9 sets or the newer 2020 CX and BX models, you have a fast, high refresh panel that can deliver 120 Hz and can even do extra tricks like black frame insertion in 60 FPS titles. But there is one point of crucial differentiation. At 4K resolution, the B9 and C9 only handle variable refresh rate at between 40 to 60 Hz. You need to drop down to 1440p or 1080p for VRR up to 120 Hz. BX and CX support VRR between 40 and 120 Hz at all resolutions, including 4K. So yeah, overall the OLEDs are our recommendation simply due to their phenomenal contrast and per pixel high dynamic range. But if OLED's not your bag, we can also recommend Samsung's Q95T and Q80T as solid alternatives aiming for the same target. Now, Sony itself is starting to market a range of what it calls ready for PlayStation 5 displays, but they will need firmware updates, and right now it's not guaranteed that all of those screens will support the full range of features. We have an article linked in the video description below that covers our recommendations for the best HDMI 2.1 displays, and if the Sony offerings do make the grade, we'll update that with our findings. Right, so moving on. HDMI 2.1 screens are great, obviously, but the thing is that while monstrously large displays are fine for the living room, a lot of people game elsewhere in the home or indeed in the office, and that's where PC monitor options come in. The upcoming Eve Spectrum may be worth looking at, as it does indeed have confirmed HDMI 2.1 support. In its 4K configuration, you get to enjoy up to 144 Hz gameplay at this peak resolution, though I suspect it will top out at 120 Hz with the next-gen console. And literally as we sat down to edit this piece, ASUS announced its own range of HDMI 2.1 certified displays. Now there's one more thing I want to address, which is that while 120 Hz support is being touted for consoles, we may well be seeing something a bit different in some titles. Frame rate support up to 120 frames per second, not a locked 120 frames per second as such. And this is where variable refresh rate technology comes into play. Rather than introduce screen tearing or display VSync stutter on drop frames, VRR stops the display from updating at a fixed time period and instead lets the GPU tell the screen when it's good and ready to update with a new frame. So in this archive footage here, we're seeing how VRR operates at a much lower frame rate, between 40 to 60 frames per second. We should be seeing VSync stutter here, but we're not. It's still silky smooth. So look, there may be next-gen games targeting 60 frames per second that don't quite hit the target, and VRR could make a big difference here in eliminating the traditional stutter we get. Meanwhile, the same technology working on frame rates between 60 to 120 frames per second will be even smoother still. So yeah, the combination of VRR and 120Hz support, it could be really exciting stuff. So that breaks down the situation with 120Hz gaming on consoles based on everything we know right now. With the marketing we've seen from the platform holders, it's clear that Xbox Series X is making a bigger push for the technology. Gears 5, Halo Infinite and other titles are all getting the option, and it's great to see. As a bullet point for what next-gen gaming is all about, alongside ray tracing and faster SSD streaming, higher refresh rate support perhaps won't be a game changer for AAA titles, but what it does do is open the door to new types of experiences, esports first and foremost amongst them. But of all of the HDMI 2.1 features, maybe it's VRR that will prove more useful for more gamers. The implementation on Xbox One right now isn't quite where it should be, but what became clear to me during my visit to Microsoft earlier this year is that the way it's been designed makes a lot more sense for Series X and integration with the firm's DLI feature. That's dynamic latency input, a key push from the platform holder to cut input lag across the entire pipeline. The idea being that a more responsive game is a better feeling game and, well, an improved experience in general. But that's all from me for now. Please do like, subscribe and share if you found the content useful. And yes, the bell. I do seem to talk about it quite a lot, right? But please consider ringing it, as doing so gives you instant notifications whenever Digital Foundry posts new content. And as always, DF Patreon supporters, we salute you. It's your support that allows us to produce the content we're passionate about and helps immensely in a world where YouTube ad revenue alone won't pay all of the bills. And of course, supporters get pristine quality video downloads of everything we do. And that's only going to become more important as next-gen games arrive. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, and just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.